Hi, so this video is a little bit overdue, but that's okay. So today we are going to be talking about my second latest read, and I will get to my latest read eventually, Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Now, this novel was translated, I believe it was from French. However, the author, Milan Kundera, is a Franco-Czech author. He was born in Brno. Not sure that's how you pronounce it. But he eventually moved to France, and there's a quote from him that he always wants his novels to be taught as a French novel. And that's kind of an important little thing that I think really presents itself in this. But anyway, this is going to have spoilers. I also hated this book, so let's get right into it. Just realized as I was editing this that I never got to why I thought it was interesting that Kundera wanted his novels to be taught as French. But anyways, let me explain. People tend to think of French novels as having lots of themes of love, which is an interesting one because not always, but yeah, I will say pretty often you have a lot of these novels, especially from French or translated from French, that deal with love, that deal with the nature of it. And I will say that the Czech novel is largely a Kafka thing. But I've never read a work by Kafka and been like, oh yeah, this is so lovely. I think America by Kafka is the closest thing you could possibly get to a novel about love in Czech. But I also do think, being Franco-Czech, that Kundera did explore that relationship very interestingly with especially the unbearable lightness of being, because it is kind of Kafkaesque. It talks a lot about the Prague Spring, and it talks a lot about the authorities and people listening, but it also does again talk a lot about that French side of it, that concept of love, the concept of what does it mean to love and what does it mean to have a relationship with people. So that's kind of that. Sorry that I didn't get into that in the video. I don't know what I was thinking. So, to start out with this book is that we pretty much follow two main couples and thus 4 people total. So, the first couple is Thomas and Teresa, and the second couple is Sabine and Franz. So, we start out with Thomas, and he is a bad person. Let me get into that. So, Thomas is a surgeon, and there's a whole series of events that leads him to meeting Teresa. However, Thomas is also a serious womanizer. Just women all the time. Every night, sometimes during the day, just all these women, and he's always sleeping around with all these women. But he has one woman, and he describes this lady as this very kind of gritty, she's an artist, and her name is Sabina. And she comes back eventually, and in my opinion, she is the most interesting character of this entire book. She seems to be relatively well fleshed out for a author as, in my opinion, misogynistic as Milan Kundera. However, I am a feminist, so I can't be saying much about what authors are misogynist, because a lot of them are. Anyway, so we start out with Franz, and he's kind of contemplating his love for Sabina. He's like, oh, I don't really know what to do with her, because I also like to fuck other women. So the book follows 2 couples and 4 main characters. You have your very first couple, Thomas and Teresa, and then you have the second couple of Franz and Sabina. So the book starts out with Thomas being introduced to us first. Thomas is first and foremost a surgeon, and he's a pretty good one at that. People regard him pretty highly. His second personality trait, though, is being a womanizer. And not just oh, sometimes I cheat on my girlfriends. No, he has multiple affairs with multiple different women, sometimes twice a day. But he's doing it with all these women at least once a day, right? So he's contemplating a little bit on his main lover, his kind of, I suppose, just the main lover. Her name is Sabina, and again, she comes back later in the book. And Sabine is an artist, and she is a little bit gritty. She has a certain quality to her that I think she's very much written for the male gaze, but in a really strange way that's not like, oh, I'm not a cute, like, oh, you know, like, not like the cutesy sort of way, no, like the, oh, I'm so cool, wow, I smoke cigarettes sort of way. It's interesting, but in my opinion, she's my favorite character. I love her. She's, wow, I should have said this now, but in my opinion, she is the most interesting character out of all of them. And she has a lot of depth to her compared to all the other characters. And there's just a lot to her. She's a really interesting character. But so it starts out with Thomas, and he's kind of just thinking on his balcony, like, oh, do we actually love this woman? Yada, yada, yada. And then he meets Teresa. And Teresa's a pretty simple girl. She's working as a bartender in a hotel or something. And she goes, I believe they're in Prague. Oh, by the way, it takes place during the Prague Spring. But so she's kind of just working as a bartender. And she meets Thomas, and they have a one-night stand. And for some reason, Thomas is like, this is the woman for Thomas right here. No, who needs all these other women, probably hundreds of them throughout his lifetime? No, the woman he needs is Teresa. And he eventually asks her to come back after only meeting her for like 5 hours. And they eventually get married. So this is kind of important because all this time, Thomas is still womanizing. Thomas is still having all these affairs, and it's so messy. However, Milan Kundera is, in my opinion, a misogynist. He is also really pseudo-intellectual with this book. He loves to just go on these philosophical rants. Indeed, the first 2 pages of this book is just Nietzsche. Okay, cool. Great! I love Nietzsche too, but like, if I was gonna write a book, I wouldn't be putting Nietzsche in every other page. And it's not just Nietzsche, no, it's also Kant and Hegel and all these great philosophers. And he thinks, oh, I'm so cool, and I'm, writing this wonderful, glorious essay, and I'm just having these characters that could be of some depth. And I understand, it's not Milan Kundera's writing style necessarily to have very fleshed out characters. He has this sort of detachment. It's cold, and while this novel is to some parts very warm and very welcoming, and you really want to just like bathe in it, he does write this in such a way where it is actually really hard to penetrate the coldness that is truly the book's soul. And I think that is the reason that it is so philosophical and pseudo-intellectual. I don't want to call this book a good work of, like, self-help, which it could possibly be kind of self-helpy, because it's, again, so much philosophy. No, because this book fundamentally does not know what it's talking about, because it kind of just meanders its way along. You have all these characters, and they're all thinking and all kind of philosophizing. However, the only ones that are actually, like, really doing substantial thinking and important thinking are the men. So, with all that being said, let's move on to the second part of this, that is Sabina and Franz, because it gets worse. So if you recall Sabina from being Thomas's main lover, they kind of have a fallout, and it's a little bit weird, and basically some time passes, and Thomas is still womanizing. He actually gets in a whole scuffle, I think with the authorities or something, and he eventually just becomes a window cleaner. Weird, but okay. But during all this time, Sabina has moved to Switzerland. Wow. And she meets another man. His name is Franz, and by the way, they're both like 40 during this. And they kind of become lovers. And I say kind of because you don't really know if they're lovers. They're couples. Definitely, they are couples. But to call them lovers is perhaps a stupid thing, because not really lovers, are they? They're kind of just being in each other's company. And Franz, I think, was married during this time. So he's doing a similar thing that Thomas did, but he's not like a huge womanizer. He just has this affair. And it brings about a bunch of whole crazy things. And there's just so much mud, I guess, in this, that you don't, I even have never really understood why people tend to put Franz and Sabina together and call them lovers or couples, because they are couples, yes, but I don't believe that they love each other. And if they loved each other, that would have been shown. You know, Teresa really does, I think, love Franz, and at the end of this book, they end up moving to like a really small countryside town, and it actually gets really sweet from there. And it becomes a really nice, lovely novel, and Milan Kundera takes a step back with the pretentiousness and kind of just finally lets them live, and that's not what happens necessarily with Franz and Sabina. I think it is Franz, I'm not entirely confident, that he ends up going to like Cambodia or something. He ends up dying in Cambodia. What? But that basically just leaves Sabina, and she moves to America, and she becomes a great artist. And she's, again, insanely interesting woman. Good job. Woman power. But that kind of takes place when Thomas is still being a window cleaner. Okay, cool. Great. Lovely. So, that's kind of that whole situation. And again, I really didn't like that Sabina and Franz became lovers, because again, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Weird stuff happened. And I think, just to finish this portion of this video, there's a distinct quote that really stood out to me, and I can't remember the quote right now, but it talks a lot about, like, Beethoven. And this book talks a lot about Beethoven, one of his quartets, Eis muss sein. I can't speak German. But it's this little ending of one of his quartets or something. Again, I also don't listen to Beethoven. I listen to Shostakovich. So, again, I don't know. But it talks about musical motifs. And the life is as a metaphor. Music is a metaphor for life. And with Thomas and Teresa, it explained that they met each other when they were in the very first bars of their composition of life. So everything kind of intertwined, and they got to understand themselves and the music of their life easier. However, with Sabina and Franz, these motifs that they had established, that they were communicating between each other, had already been established, and they meant different things to both of them. Thus, they cannot connect as well in the musical of life as Thomas and Teresa did. And I think that's a really beautiful explanation for this. And again, I'm not a fan of this book, really, at all. But I do think that, there's moments like that where they are memorable. So finally, to finish this book off, and my parents just got home, so I gotta be quiet, I want to talk about the intellectualness of this book, because there is none. And it's basically, the whole book, in my opinion, is a philosophical essay by Milan Kundera explaining love and the nature of love. And there's a lot that happens again with Thomas, and I've brought this up a few times, is that he is inherently a womanizer. He has a lot of sex with women. So, it kind of justifies this by explaining that love and sex are completely different things, and that sex can lead to love, but love does not always lead to sex. And I think that's an interesting plot to this, because inherently, Thomas is a pretty bad person to his wife, and it makes me really sad that for some reason Kundera was, willing to write that. But there was a lot of intellectualness with this book that I think is really interesting, and there's a lot of discussion of philosophy that I do think makes this book a very compelling one. However, it does not make it compelling to the extent that it is readable and understandable, and something that, again, I do want to read. It is very hard to read this book because there are so many different parts moving around with it. If this was nonfiction and more of a treatise on love, then I think it could have been really good. But Kundera took all these characters and tried to illustrate his essay, and it just didn't work out because he didn't know how to do it. And he is an excellent writer, I will say. He is a good writer. But the concept of this book was never fully established. And again, people point out that, Kundera isn't, he didn't try to flesh out his characters, that's his whole point. But I think he also didn't try to flesh out his ramblings. And if he had, it wouldn't have been pseudo-intellectual. It would have been genuinely intellectual and genuinely something that I want to read. But it wasn't, because he didn't know how to, and it's all okay. I get that. But I just don't understand why people like this book so much. Also, again, it's just kind of misogynist. The main moment of Teresa is her, like, talking about her body. And I think, yeah, like, women's obsession with their bodies is something that is really interesting and should be talked about a lot more. Because it is a, fun. It's because of the patriarchy. And I will just say right now, it's because of the patriarchy. But it does that in such a way that it's like, oh, the only good thing she could possibly think about is body. Which is exactly the problem with thinking about the body as a woman, is that you are expected that to have that as your biggest priority. And on some level it is. You also have the dog, Carradine, which is a whole different factor to this. I'm not going to get into the dog because it's just a weird one. But I do think that how the choices that Milan Kundera made in writing Teresa were poor. But I do think that they could have been done a little bit better. And if they were, then maybe I would have liked it. But alas. So finally, to finish this review off, sorry about all the spoilers. I actually don't know how to talk through a review without adding spoilers, but I'm going to give this book 2 stars. Not 2.1, 2.7. No, solid 2 stars. It was just weird. It was just really weird. I didn't like it. It was so hard getting through this book, and it genuinely put me in a reading slump. So, not like a good one, not like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I read that, it was so glorious, I can't possibly read anything else. No, it was like I hated this. Wow, I can't get over it in some level. But yeah, so that's my review of Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Thank you.